Hello everybody, myself Dr. Ashok Kumar Bisurapur, Associate Professor, Department of Education, Karnataka State Akkamadi Women's University, Vijaypura. Today we shall discuss CTE-01 in that Unit 10. So CTE is a course at IGNOU. The Unit 10 deals with the role of errors. How the errors occurs, the role of errors in language learning, 1, and contrastive analysis and error analysis. In that, let us discuss about learner errors and contrastive analysis or contrastive analysis, error analysis, inter-language. So now let us see how the mistake happens. All learners make mistakes. Of course, it is universally acceptable. As someone has said, you cannot learn without goofing. Whether you are learning how to ride a bicycle or how to fly a kite or learn a language. Everyone does make mistakes. You are humble, or else if you are a goof, you should make mistakes. Mistakes always happens. But if you perceive with your learning efforts under proper guidance, you are able to overcome or correct your mistakes. When this happens, you are said to have learned something. Learning a language also involves making mistakes or errors. This is true even when one is learning one's mother tongue. That is L1, as we know that L1 means mother tongue, first language learning. The child, as it grows up, goes through a long process of making mistakes and correcting them till he or she reaches a stage when we can say that he or she has learned her or his mother tongue. That being so, it is not surprising that those learning a second language often make mistakes. However, the mistakes or errors committed by the learners of a second language present a rather more complex and interesting case because these language learners too have already learned another language, that is their mother tongue. Linguists and language teachers have always been interested in finding out why second language learners make mistakes. Teachers, of course, are primarily interested in correcting such mistakes and making sure that their pupils do not repeat. But the thing is, it's very interesting that though the pupils do not repeat or persist with such mistakes, however, we all know that it is easier to correct or remedy something if we know the cause or the reason behind it. Contrastive analysis and error analysis present two different views about such mistakes and provide radically different explanations for them. Let us see how these views are and rectified. Two views about learners' errors. Development in psychology and linguistics over the last 50 years or so have provided radically different answers to questions such as how do people learn languages and why do language learners make mistakes? Around the 1950s, behaviorist psychology was in vogue and had tremendous impact on the linguistic thinking of that time, popularly referred to as structural linguistics. According to this thinking, language was thought of as a system consisting of subsystems, that is, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics. Learning a language was considered a matter of forming habits. That is, the system of a language could be learned by habit formation through imitation, constant practice, and reinforcement by way of appreciation or approval by parents and teachers. Imitation practice and reinforcement finally led to a stage at which the language habits became fixed, or and we came to know that this uh, the errors, I mean how the errors commit and how these errors uh, were rectified and what type of errors we are seeing in the language usage. Imitation practice and reinforcement finally led to a stage at which the language habits became fixed or automatic. This way of thinking was very interesting implications for second language learning. The second language learner is, by implication, one who has already learned a set of habits relating to the system of his or her first language. Now, when this learner starts learning a second language, he or she has to learn a fresh set of habits pertaining to the system of the second language. The structuralist behaviorist belief was that since a new system had to be learned, the system that had already been learned would interfere and create difficulties. In the other words, since each language represents a unique system, there are bound to be differences between the system of first language and second language. For the structuralist, therefore, those features of the system of first language which were different from or dissimilar to the features of the system of first language were responsible for the learner's errors or mistakes. This phenomenon was often referred to as interference or transfer, which simply stated means that second language learners tend to carry over certain features of their first language into the second language they are engaged in learning. When there is similarity between the features of the two languages, there is no learning problem. But where there is a mismatch of dissimilarity, errors arise. That is what the main thing points to be remembered. This being the case, the structuralist behaviorist position regarding second language learners' error was that they represented a failure on the part of the learner to learn a new set of habits, as well as a failure to modify her or his earlier set of habits. In a nutshell, this view maintained that errors represent a failure to learn a new set of habits. Errors, if allowed to continue, will become set habits since language learning is habit formation And errors are caused by interference whereby features of first language are carried over or transferred into the second language by the learner. The second view about second language learners' mistakes is based on the fundamental tenets of cognitive psychology and the transformational, generative, or the post-structural thinking in linguistics. This view considers language a thinking process rather than a set of habits. It follows, therefore, that language learning, either it is mother tongue or second language, can best be seen as a process of problem solving in which the learner faced with the data tries to make sense of that data. The learner forms hypotheses about the language system and that he or she is learning. He or she generalizes on the basis of these hypotheses and forms rules. Some of her or his generalizations may turn out to be right and the others wrong. The wrong generalizations represent errors, but and this is important. These errors do not represent a failure to learn a new set of habits or to modify an earlier set of habits. They represent rather the creativity of the learner and give us valuable clues to the way his or her mind is working. The shift from behaviorist psychology to cognitive psychology and the attendant change of focus in linguistic brought about a major change in our attitudes towards the faults or errors of second language learners. The major assumption underlying these new attitudes may be viewed as the first one, language learning. It hardly matters whether it is mother tongue learning or second language learning, implies making assumptions about the structure of the language, its phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics. Based on these assumptions, the learners formulate hypotheses about the structure of the language they are learning. Each time they use this language, they are, as a matter of fact, testing out their hypothesis. The learner's incorrect hypothesis, their so-called errors, give us valuable clues about the assumption they are making about the structure of the language that they are learning, and gives and given A, B, C and learners errors assume enormous significance. What we have discussed a couple of seconds ago, the 3 points significance for the language teacher. They indicate that the learners are thinking and help the teaching gear her or his teaching to correct the learner's wrong assumptions so that they can move closer to the structure and system of the language they are learning. This view of learners' errors does not totally deny that interference and transfer do have a role and constitute a central process in second language learning. It, however, does not agree with the structuralist position that they constitute the only or even the major process involved in the learning of second language. Now let us see some more about learners' errors. As we have discussed, all learning involves making mistakes. So does language learning. However, not all the mistakes are faults. We see in the performance of second language learners are of the same order or the same serious nature. Applied linguists and language teachers now recognize that this fact and following S.P. Cordor in 1967-1971 make a distinction between three types of faults. That is number one, errors. As error is a grammatically incorrect form and is a sure indication that the learner has not mastered the code of the second language. At this point, we will not go into the reason why such errors occur. The fact is that if someone says he go instead of he goes, or she talked to his husband on the telephonic instead of she talked to her husband on the telephone, it is an obvious indication that the learner has not learned the correct grammatical forms and the underlying grammatical rules of English. Such faults constitute serious problems and the teacher is expected to take steps to correct them. Such grammatical faults are called errors. Now let us see mistakes. Second one, mistakes. These are socially inappropriate forms. Both first language and second language users make such mistakes, that is social gaffes. And the seriousness of such mistakes can vary in a degree. Forms which are otherwise grammatically correct may be socially inappropriate and hence unacceptable. Learning a language means learning to use that language in a social context. And third one, lapses. These are faults that can be best described as slips of the tongue or pen. They are not a matter of great concern, as all of us at one time or the other make silly slips due to carelessness, sloppiness, or just inadvertently. However, one has to be on one's guard, especially if one is a teacher, in deciding when a lapse is not a lapse at all, but an error. If a learner, while writing a composition, spells the word deceive as deceive or the word husband as husband, the first such occurrence will have to be treated as a lapse, that is, a slip of the pen. But if the same thing is repeated in the same or subsequent compositions by the same learner, it would have to be treated as an error representing an incorrect or faulty learning of the spelling system of English. As such, language learning includes learning both what is grammatically correct and what is socially appropriate. When a first language user makes a mistake, he or she soon realizes it and makes suitable amends for it. While the second language user or learner may sometimes not even be aware that he or she has made a mistake, or when made aware of the mistake, he or she may not know how to make amends for it. The notion of mistake as distinct from that of the error points to the need that our second language teaching programs lay equal emphasis on grammar, that is formal code of, that is what we know, that second language L2, and the social context in which the second language is intended to be used. There is a simple test to determine whether a given fault is an error or mistake. If on hearing or reading a sentence, you can react by saying, "This is not how it is said," you are referring to a mistake, a usage or form that is socially inappropriate and unacceptable. In our view, mistakes are perhaps more serious than errors, in that a grammatical error can be easily excused or even overlooked, but social gaffes gaffes or mistakes can cause disapproval, anger, or even rejection. So this is about how the mistakes takes place. In the what we discussed in a couple of seconds ago, it shows that as learning goes on, the mistakes should be rectified, and mistakes should be removed, and they should be correction made, language, I mean error free language. In the light of the above, I mean what we discussed, it must be clear by now that when confronted with faults, we have to ask ourselves several questions before we can set about taking corrective or remedial measures. The questions are: how serious is the fault? Is the fault random or systematic and recurrent? Is there any way of explaining why or how a particular fault occurs? The answers to these questions will enable us to recognize a fault and label or characterize it as an error, a mistake, or lapse. Further, if the faults are systematic and recurrent, we as teachers would be able to devise ways to deal with them or correct them. Thirdly, we shall be able to find some explanation for the appearance of such faults. So, this is how we have to uh, overcome the mistakes and lapses. Now, let us see contrastive analysis. Lado in 1957, in his foreword to the book Linguistics Across Culture, I mean, while forwarding the book Linguistics Across Cultures, C.C. Fries states categorically that a child in learning his native language has not only learned to attend to the particular contrast that function as signals in the language. He has learned to ignore all those factors, I mean features and factors that do not so function. Learning a second language, therefore, constitutes a very different task from learning the first language. In the author's preface to the same book, Robert Lado says, the plan of the book rests on the assumption that we can predict and describe the patterns that will cause difficulty in learning, and those that will not cause difficulty by comparing systematically the language and culture to be learned with the native language and culture of the student. These two quotations represent the strong claim made by the proponents of contrastive analysis. In essence, they were claimed that a learner of second language has already learned a set of habits and the rules of the system of his or her first language. When the learner comes to the second language, he or she has to learn a new set of habits and the rules of another system. Wherever there are dissimilarities in the system of first language and second language, the learner would face difficulties. Contrastive analysis thus not only claimed to offer a complete explanation of the causes of the learner's faults in terms of interference and transfer of features of first language into the second language, it is also claimed to be able to predict the errors that learner would be most likely to make in terms of dissimilarities between the two languages in question. These differences or dissimilarities, they said, would continue the problem areas or blind spots for the second language learners. In short, if we know the structure of the learner's first language and the structure of the second language being learned, we would know beforehand exactly where the learners would face learning problems. Now let us see potential sources of errors for Hindi first language speakers learning English. As we have discussed, interference and transfer can take place at all the level of language structure. It can be at the level of the sound system or at the level of word formation or at the level of syntax and at the level of semantics or assigning meanings to the utterances. Since each language has a unique structure, there are bound to be some differences and dissimilarities between first language and second language in respect to features at each of these levels as far as their organization, their internal contracts and their distribution are concerned. So let us see Indian learners of English as a second language and how the potential sources of errors and such a systematic contrastive analysis are relevant. The second language, that is L2, may have a feature which does not exist at all in the learner's first language. Taking as our own example the case of a native speaker of Hindi learning, that is English as a second language, we find that at the level phonology, that is phonology means sound system, English has several sounds that are not there in Hindi. In fact, in most Indian languages, consider for instance the sounds are represented by the letter combination it in the following words: think, throw, thank, this, there, them. So what are these? The sounds are represented by it in the words in the two columns. I mean the two what we have what I said the six words are phonetically represented as it and it. These two sounds have no corresponding counterparts in Hindi. The same is the case with the sound represented by S in the following in the words. Treasure, leisure, and pleasure are the vowel sound represented by phonetically as E, who, as occurring in the words such as day, way, pray, go, home, stone. A contrastive analysis of Hindi and English further show that where English has a system of stress placement which can alter the pronunciation of words as well as their meaning. Hindi has no such system of stress placement on different syllables of words. This feature of English will therefore constitute a problem area that the Hindi speaker will need to cope with. He or she will find it difficult to make a distinction between the two realizations of the word contact. As a noun, when the stress is placed on the first syllable, that is thanked, and as a verb, when the stress is placed on the second syllables, that is, if you say, for example, thank only, he or she will tend to pronounce it as Thamtak, irrespective of whether it is being used as a noun or a verb. So here a contrastive analysis of Hindi and English would further reveal that there are several cases where an element or feature is present in both the languages but operates within a different set of contracts. According to the rule operative in English, the P in the words in the people, proper, and paper in realized as P in the word initial position. But the second occurrence of P, that is top, capital, cat, is read as P since it occurs in the middle of the word or at the end and belongs to an unstressed syllable in the capital. Thus, we have a case of an element of a feature being present in both first language and second language, but with different phonemic status and different set of contracts. The result is that the Hindi speaker learning English as a second language either fails to perceive and produce the aspirated variant of P or due to over eagerness and hyper correction uses the aspirated, even those syllables where the unaspirated variant is to be used. At the level of syntax, one might cite the example of question formation in Hindi and English. Both languages use the device of inserting or adding question words such as why, where, what, etc. For example, in English, he is going, where is going, why is he going, when is he going, etc. In Hindi, if you take it account, वो राजा रहा है, वो जा रहा है, वो जा रहा है, वो कहाँ जा रहा है, वो क्यों जा रहा है, वो कब जा रहा है, कब जा रहा है. This is what the pronunciation, the strength, the stress what will give. It must be obvious from the sentences what we came to in English and Hindi a couple of seconds ago, that whereas Hindi forms questions by simply inserting a question word after the subject of the sentence without any other change in the pattern of the corresponding affirmative sentence. English requires not only the addition of a question word at the beginning of the sentence but also a change in the word order whereby the position of the subject is changed and it is moved after the auxiliary verb. So here contrastive analysis can help us identify the possible areas in which the learner of a second language would be likely to face problems. A thorough and systematic contrastive analysis of the learner's first language and the second language he or she is trying to learn can, according to the structuralist, thus pinpoint learning problems in the areas of sounds, words, syntax, semantics, and even culture. Now let's go for error analysis. While contrastive analysis has much to offer the second language, teacher by way of explicating how certain errors committed by second language learners are caused by differences and dissimilarities between the learner's first language and the second language. It has its limitations. First of all, it is based on too mechanistic a view of language learning and treats the process of language learning as nothing more than a matter of imitation, practice, and habit formation. Secondly, contrastive analysis has no explanation to offer for those errors of the learners that come about due to reasons other than mere structural or systematic differences between the two languages concerned or the mistakes that learners commit while learning their mother tongue or first language. The new perspective on errors, partly as a challenge to the basic tenets and claims of contrastive analysis, and partly in order to provide a fresh approach to learners' errors. The notion of error analysis was first proposed in the late 1960s. As we have discussed, the rise of cognitive psychology and the post-structural transformational generative thinking in linguistics gave a new mentalist orientation to our views regarding language learning and learning mistakes. This focus on the mental activity of the learner provided a new perspective on learners' errors. If the learner was using his or her mind to process the language being learnt, errors could not be viewed as bad or as failure to learn. Errors had to be looked at as positive signs of mental activity on the part of the learner as well as clues to the direction of the learner's thinking. But the proponents of error analysis would, of course, call this an error, but they would also see this as a positive sign that the learner is mentally active in processing the second language data and arriving at some sort of rules according to which the system of English works. As such, they would be reluctant to treat it as a failure to learn or bad habit formation. We must point out here that this new attitude to learners' errors does not imply approval of errors or absence of corrective or remedial teaching. In error analysis, some preliminary questions need to be asked. Like this, the questions are the errors random or systematic? Are the mistakes or errors trivial or serious and crucially important? Are there any ways of explaining why particular errors occurs? What are the best ways to prevent recurrence of errors? In order to arrive at answers of these questions, error analysis makes a distinction between errors, mistakes, and lapses. Clearly, lapses or slips of the tongue or pen have to be treated as trivial and hence ignored. The performance of the learner is then processed for finding answers to the questions. What is this process, which involves several steps, which are recognizing a fault. Given a learner's sentence as data, the first question that needs to be asked is this sentence possible in the language being learnt? This question relates to the formal structure of the learner's sentence and has no reference to the social or textual context. It is a question as to whether the sentence is well formed according to the rules of the grammar of the target language. Again, if the answer to this question if it is in negative, we are faced with a mistake, that is some contravention of the social code. If however the answer to the question is also positive, there is nothing further for the error analysis. Now second one, describing a fault. Given that the learner sentence is found to contain some mistakes or errors, we need to describe or characterize the fault. This exercise of characterizing the fault is useful since it tells the teacher whether a learner commits errors or that he or she is grammatically competent but makes a lot of mistakes. It also helps the language teacher focus attention on the specific areas in which the learner needs to be guided. Third one, explaining the fault. Once the fault has been recognized and described, be it an error or a mistake, we need to look for a plausible explanation for the appearance of the fault. The error or mistake could occur, number one, because of sheer carelessness or laziness. Number two, because the item that appears as a fault has never been taught or brought to the notice of the learner. Number three, because the learner has formed some wrong hypothesis about the formal structure or the social conventions relating to the target language. Number four, because some formal or social features relating to the learner's first language have interfered and have been carried over into the target language. Now let's see fourth one, remedying the fault. Depending upon the kind of answers and information, the first three steps in the process of error analysis provides the teacher can prepare teaching materials, special exercises or intensive drills, or even the explanations in order to correct or remedy the error or mistake. Systematic error analysis also can help the teacher in ignoring faults that are mere lapses and carrying on with the task of attending to those faults that are crucially important. Now let us see interlanguage. The post-structuralist view of language learning, influenced significantly by cognitive psychology, emphasized the role of the mental faculty of the learner. The second language learner was seen, according to this view, as engaged in processing the second language data in order to make sense of it. Making sense of the second language data implied that the learner was making assumptions and hypotheses about the language being learnt. These assumptions and hypotheses can be viewed as a system rather than as scattered or isolated instances of mistakes or deviations from the system of the second language. It is this system that has been variously referred to as idiosyncratic dialect or corridor, approximative system, NEMSER, interlanguage, Selinker, and learner's language. The term interlanguage has, however, come to be accepted generally. The term is a very useful one as it enables us to look at the learner's performance at any given point of time during the learning process and describe it systematically in terms of its own structure and features and assess how and where it is different from the standard system of the target language. That is the language being learnt. Such a systematic description would enable us to see the assumptions the learner has made, the generalizations and rules about the target language that he or she has formed, the degree to which his or her interlanguage approximates to the system of the target language, and the gaps or differences between the two systems that still exist. The notion of interlanguage also gives us a more dynamic and positive view of the learner's learning strategies as he or she perseveringly and steadily moves towards the target system. Now, as language teachers, we can more effectively facilitate learners to learn language if we are aware of certain crucial questions and concepts. So, we have discussed that understand why learners of second language make mistakes, and we have made understood that why learners of second language make mistakes, and we have come to that aware of the different types of mistakes made by the learners, and we are familiar with the two major approaches to mistakes errors, that is contrastive analysis and error analysis. Now in the contrastive analysis, the comparison of the linguistic systems of two languages, for example the sound system or the grammatical system. Contrastive analysis is based on the following assumptions. So we have seen, just we will highlight what are those two assumptions. Number one, the main difficulties in learning a new language are caused by interference from the first language. And second one, these difficulties can be predicted especially in those areas where the two languages differ the most. And we have come across the word diphthong also. What is this diphthong? Diphthong is a speech sound which is usually considered as one distinctive vowel of a particular language, but really involves two vowels, with one vowel gliding to the other. Example, fight, fight. And we have come across error analysis. The study and analysis of the errors made by second and foreign language learners. And we encountered the concept of interference or transfer. What is this? The effect of one language on the learning of another. And the next term you have come across interlanguage or idiosyncratic dialect or learner's language. It's the type of language produced by second and foreign language learners who are in the process of learning a new language. Now comes first language, a person's mother tongue or the language acquired first. Second language, the language which a person learns later after the mother tongue. Lapse. So we have encountered the certain concept like lapse, mistakes. What is lapse? Lapse, a mistake made by a learner when speaking or writing, which is caused by lack of attention, fatigue, carelessness, and so on. And mistake, often a socially inappropriate form. And we have come across another concept, that is phoneme, the smallest unit of sound in a language. Phoneme. What is phoneme? The smallest unit of sound in a language which can distinguish two words. For example, the words pan and ban differ in their initial sounds. Therefore, P and B are the phonemes of English here. And semantics, often we use these terms in our discussion. Semantics, this is pertaining to meaning. Syntax, pertaining to grammar. And we have come across transformational grammar also. What is transformational grammar? A theory of grammar which was proposed by the American linguist Noam Chomsky in 1957. It has since been developed by him and other linguists. Chomsky attempts to provide a model for the description of all languages. A grammar, a grammar tries, a teacher who is teaching a grammar tries to show with a system of rules the knowledge which a native speaker of a language uses in a forming grammatical sentences. So, especially the interlanguage gives some assumptions and hypotheses about the language being learnt. These assumptions and hypotheses can be viewed as a system rather than a scattered or isolated instances of mistakes or deviation from the system of the second language. In other words, in learning a language, the learner is gradually building up a system of rules which exist in its own right. So, this system of rules built up by the learner is not the system of his or her first language or mother tongue. It is at also not the ideal or standard system of the second language he or she learning. This learner system has to be seen as an evolving and developing one, continuously moving towards the system of the target language. So, explaining the fault is very important in language learning. So, we have to give feedback to the learners about their faults, mistakes, and lapses. Of course, lapses, though knowingly or unknowingly occurs, but it should not be repeatable. And fault on the part of pronunciation of words and how it will be rectified, because language is acquired through imitation. Whenever a teacher utter a sound, it will be imitated by the learner immediately. So, there is a dire need that the teacher should put efforts completely to make his learner understand how the sound pattern is very important in learning foreign language. Of course, there is a difference between learning the first language and second language. As we have seen the Hindi and English in our discussion, the stress on a particular word or letter is different in different languages. So the mistakes committed by the students in reading or writing English language should be rectified, it should be improved, it should be given feedback by a teacher. So there is a need that a teacher should have competency and potentialities in using foreign language. The faults, lapses, and mistakes are always in the foreign language. But is there any practice to overcome this mistake is a question. This question has a reference to the socio-cultural context and to the given social conventions. Again, If the answer to this question is in the negative, we are faced with a mistake, that is some contravention of the social code. If, however, the answer to this question is also positive, there is nothing further for the error analyst to do, as we have a grammatically correct and socially appropriate sentence. So, recognizing a fault is very important in learning a foreign language. The sentence used by a teacher while teaching, and same thing is while in practice uttered by a student commit a mistake. The immediate feedback will accommodate the learner at a proper position as a second language learner. It is the practice in Indian classrooms that bilingual method is followed to overcome the mistakes in the second language. As the training improves, students are well versed with the practices of the second language. There are some questions, as I told you, that are there any ways of explaining why particular errors occur? What are the best ways to prevent recurrence of errors? In order to arrive at answer to these questions, as I told you, I repeat once again, error analysis makes a distinction between errors, mistakes, and lapses. Clearly, lapses or slips of the tongue or pen have to be treated as trivial and hence ignored. So, this ignorance should not be repeated. I mean, the training to the new learner should be adequate. The four skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, should make the learner to overcome the mistakes, lapses, and fault. That is why a language teacher should be competent in using a language. Both teacher and taught should strive hard to overcome the faults, lapses, and mistakes. If these mistakes, lapses, and faults continue throughout the teaching learning process, ultimately it leads to the curbing of the learner's enthusiasm to learn new language. So, extra care should be taken by a teacher to overcome the mistakes, lapses, and faults. Proper usage of language and accommodating the interest of the learner in the foreign language, creating interest so that accommodating them in the foreign language is utmost priority by a teacher. So, a teacher of second language or foreign language or second language teaching should acquaint in adequate language usage so that let make the second language learning so easy instead of making it a curb to the learners. So, creating an interest in the foreign language is very important and making and preparing the learners to the challenging world. It's also a challenge, and hope the teacher will, we all the teachers will do that. Hope today we have learned so many things. So don't forget to use the information, wear the mask, maintain the social distance, and please subscribe if you're not subscribed to this channel. Thank you very much.